All right. All right. Well, hi everybody. Good afternoon. I'm here to talk about physical activity and more precisely the lack thereof that we've all had now in this year of lockdown. Can you believe it's been a year? My God. So I just like to start off by saying I think probably everyone here, unless you work in healthcare or in an Amazon warehouse, which God help you if you do. But unless you're one of those few groups, you probably are getting a lot less physical activity than you did before COVID started. And I would like to say that there's a difference here between physical activity and exercise. I'll get into that later. But let's just look at physical activity for a second. And I'd like to take the example of myself to show you how things have changed. Looking at my life now versus pre-COVID, I did this. I looked at my handy dandy phone, which told me that my average number of steps that I took in 2019 was 11,526, doing pretty well. And then in 2020, it was down to 9,852. And this year, so far, the average for the daily average is 9,233. So, I'm not doing too bad, but I noticed that, that's because of a conscious effort that I have to make. Nowadays, I make an effort to take a walk basically every day. And I'm out there for like an hour and a half because Lord knows nowadays I have the time to do that. Whereas before COVID, I just walked places. I just would walk. I remember on days when I was when I would go to Brussels to work at the European Parliament, I would walk like half an hour from the hotel I usually stayed in to the Parliament buildings. And then anybody who's been in the Parliament buildings knows that once you get there, it's like a slow marathon to just try and get anywhere. It's this huge labyrinthine complex of buildings. And usually what would happen is like I'd get to the room where the conference is, and then I'd have to like circle it about 5 times before I found the door that goes to the booths. And then once I'm in the booths, then I have to like circle the whole conference room again before I find the English booth. I'm sure, embarrassing myself in front of all the colleagues who actually know their way around those buildings along the way. But anyway, that was just like my everyday life. I didn't have to make a conscious effort to walk. It just happened, right? And nowadays, here I am. I'm in a 2-bedroom apartment all day long. And it's true that I'm getting a little bit of physical activity because I'm doing things that I used to like never do, to be honest, which is like cooking and cleaning. Those are things I did it sometimes, but like I'm definitely doing it way more now, right? Like we all are. And the other thing that I do tend to do is I go on these regular walks. Before I used to go running, but I have an injury and that's a long story. We're not going to talk about that. But these walks that I would go on, that's actual exercise. And when I say the difference between physical activity and exercise, this is what I mean. Physical activity is just you moving throughout the day to like get things done or whatever. Exercise is when you make this conscious effort to go and move around for the sake of health and fitness. So now I'm going out and getting this exercise, but my overall physical activity is still less than it was before COVID, even though my like conscious effort to exercise is much greater. Exercise, though, is weird. I'm just going to say it like that. I mean, you need physical activity to maintain your health, rather, but exercise, the idea of like going out and running 5 miles for basically no reason at all, like just to go and run just for the sake of it, right? I mean, it's weird. I think in the course of human history, like we have almost never needed to do this until like the last 100 years, maybe. Like it's weird. And you know what's even weirder is getting on a treadmill. treadmills are the weirdest thing. Did you know, this is true, the treadmill started off as a torture implement. I'm not kidding. It was invented, I don't know, in like the 18th, 19th century, probably by the Victorians because they liked this kind of thing. And it was invented as a torture instrument because it was something that was both strenuous, so it strained the body, but also completely pointless, so it tortured your mind. Oscar Wilde, when he was imprisoned, he was tortured by being forced onto a treadmill. He had to do that as part of his prison sentence. And yet we nowadays, like, how many of us go and voluntarily get on a treadmill? Like, what are we doing? This is so weird. And just to illustrate further the strangeness of exercise, the basis for my speech here comes from an interview that I listened to on the radio with somebody who is I think he calls himself like an anthropological physiologist. Anyway, he studies how people in like remote villages that have no running water and no electricity, how people in those villages move and how that affects their health. So he wanted to do a study on women in the mountains of Western Kenya. And he wanted to study something about how they walk. And he thought the best way to do this was to get a treadmill and get the treadmill in a Jeep and take it from Nairobi, I think, or wherever they were able to buy a treadmill. So probably in, one of the big cities in Kenya, and then take it in a Jeep across the entire country, over the mountains to the place that is closest to the village where the women that he wanted to study lived, but that also had electricity. So he took it to a place where he could plug the treadmill in, and then he brings the women from their village down to the place where he can plug the treadmill in. And then these women stand there and they look at this treadmill, and he like demonstrates what you're supposed to do with it. And they look at him and they're like, what? What is the point of it? They laughed at him because it is the most ridiculous contraption. And, they're not wrong. Anyway, that was a long aside. But my point is that our bodies are not actually evolved to like exercise intentionally like that. And yet nowadays we need to exercise. So what do I mean when I say our bodies were never evolved to exercise? I mean, basically, that we evolved to conserve energy rather than to expend it. I mean, we expend energy anyway just by existing. And so our bodies have adapted to try and ensure that we expend as little energy as possible. For most of human existence, the problem was getting enough energy, getting enough food. And I'd like to add that, yes, our bodies have adapted to expending as little energy as possible. But that being said, human beings are actually quite energy intensive creatures, like compared to other animals. In fact, the average sedentary American, like somebody who sits around most of the day, is still burns more calories than the average wild chimpanzee. It's true. Or at least it's true according to this interview that I listened to. They burn about the same, they do about the same amount of walking, your average sedentary American and your average wild chimpanzees. That's about 3.5 to 5 kilometers a day if you're not in lockdown. But the human reproductive cycle is extremely energy intensive, much more so than that of the chimpanzees. We have babies at twice the rate. Those babies that you have stick around for way longer. And it just takes more energy for a human to grow its own body. So that's what I'm saying. Like, humans are actually quite energy intensive creatures as far as animals go. And yet we still, have many ways that we've adapted to not expend, to try and not expend so much energy. So, and you find that when you study non-industrialized societies, that people don't expend calories unless there is a reason to do so, an explicit one, not just like getting fit. So they expend calories to get more calories, like if you're hunting or gathering food or farming. They expend calories to reproduce, not going to go into details there. Or you expend calories if there is some sort of like tangible, emotional, or social benefit. So that can be things like dancing, or participating in ceremonies, or play for children, which has myriad benefits. So these are non-industrialized societies. You find that people don't do things like run 5 miles just for the hell of it. Instead, they only move if there's a reason to. So then that might lead you to ask, all right, so what is it that these people do all day? And the fact is that they're like us. Most of the day, they sit around on their backsides, just like us. So when you hear people talk about things like sitting is the new smoking, and that I've heard the statistic that like 1 hour of sitting takes 2 hours off of your life, you don't have to believe it. It's not true. Because most of these hunter-gatherer or non-industrialized societies, they sit for like 10 hours a day, which is as much as your average American. So there's nothing bad or unnatural about wanting to sit a lot. It's what everybody does. It's natural to sit. And in fact, just because you sit a lot at work, at your job, doesn't mean that you're getting all of that you're slowly killing yourself. The problem is if you sit at your job and then you come home and also sit while you're at home, because that means that in general, yeah, you aren't getting very much physical activity. As a result, you might gain weight, and you would incur all of the deleterious health effects that go along with gaining weight. So okay, but still the news here is good, which is that just because you're sitting doesn't mean you are slowly killing yourself. Now, oh, excuse me. The other difference though between the kind of sitting that we tend to do in industrialized Western societies and the sitting that you find people doing in these hunter-gatherer societies is a matter of, I guess you would call it the quality of the sitting. So in these non-industrialized societies, they do a lot of interrupted sitting. So they sit and they're not doing a whole lot, but then, you know, every once in a while they have to get up and go do something. They have to get up and run over to the children who are playing too close to the fire. They have to get up and go get some water. They have to get up and go run after some chickens. You know, they're always having to get up, and only for a couple minutes, but they have to get up. And so every time that they get up, they're activating their muscles and they are keeping things from atrophying, which is good. The other difference is that when these people sit, they also tend not to sit in chairs, they're sitting on the ground. And the difference there is that they're not sitting in a chair with an armrest and a backrest. Excuse my microphone. They're not sitting in a chair with an armrest and a backrest. Instead, they're sitting up. So they have to keep those muscles active, keep the muscles in your core active, which means that, you know, you're not just becoming completely inert when you're just like leaning back. I mean, this is usually how I sit, where you're just like leaning back in your chair, completely inactive, and you're just sort of your whole body is like just nestled into your chair, and you're not using a single muscle to keep yourself upright. So the result of that is that when they sit, they do it for long periods of time, but it's always interrupted, and they're always doing something to work to stabilize their bodies. Excuse me, I'm just going to check my time. Okay, so I guess it looks like I should wrap up pretty soon so that nobody gets too tired. I did want to say one thing though about slouching. So basically slouching, and that's like sitting when you sit like this, you know, where you're not holding your body upright, but instead you're just like melting into your chair, which is something that I definitely like to do. So I'm not judging anybody. But if you do that, then that means you're making sitting more passive. And perhaps you've been told that if you slouch, then that's going to cause back pain. In fact, that's probably a case of correlation being confused with causation. What really might be the issue is that if you slouch, you're not activating those muscles in your back that keep your back stabilized. And that is what itself causes the back pain, is that those muscles atrophying and not getting proper and not getting proper use made of them. So basically, if you have a weak back, that's what causes back pain. It's not slouching itself that causes the back pain. It's just having a weak back. Something to think about and something to keep in mind. I would love to be able to go on. I don't want to take up too much time though, but there was also a really great part of this interview where they answered the question of whether running is bad for your knees. And I can post a link to the interview if you're interested, and you can find out for yourself. But other than that, I think all I have to say is thank you for your attention.